Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are tuning into today's webinar. Welcome to the ICLG.com webinar on digital health and data. My name is James Strode, publisher of the International Comparative Legal Guide to Digital Health 2021. Back in March, we launched the publication diving into the digital health industry from a legal perspective across 22 jurisdictions and looking in depth to topics across the industry. You may have seen a complimentary download opportunity for the publication on the home screen today, so please do make the most of that opportunity, and remember as well that it is online, free to access throughout the year. Data in healthcare allows us to create baselines, further research and knowledge, and ultimately improves patient experience and outcomes. With the healthcare industry worth over $8 trillion, it is one of the largest and fastest growing sectors across the globe, and data is now at the center of that. We've created a panel today of experts to discuss some of the important topics in healthcare data issues. So we'll be looking today at the importance of data quality, data quantity, and best practices, all with an eye on the important role of geopolitics. Before I hand over to the panel, I would like to let you know that you can be actively involved in today's session. We have a chat session on the right-hand side of your screen for any questions and comments that you may have throughout the webinar. And afterwards, we will also have the chance to do some networking through the Speed Network tool on the left-hand side of your screen. So let me introduce you to today's moderator and chair of the Precision Medicine and Digital Health Group at Haynes and Boone, Roger Kuan. Roger situated himself in the unique position in the convergence of the life and medical sciences and technology industries. This has enabled Roger to build a strong reputation on how to successfully navigate the complexities of IP, regulatory challenges, and importantly for today's sessions, data rights across the globe. A final bit of housekeeping is just to say that the views expressed on this webinar by the panel are their own views and not of the company they represent. Roger, over to you to introduce the rest of the panel and start what should be an extremely interesting hour of discussion.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Roger Kuan. As James said, I'm a partner in Haynes and Boone's San Francisco office and the current chair of their Precision Medicine and Digital Health Practice Group. My group helps their clients protect the intellectual property and data rights around their precision medicine and digital health innovations, as well as strategically advise them in transactions involving the same. I've been practicing law in this space for almost 15 years, dating back to my time as in-house counsel at Thermo Fisher Scientific, covering IP for the genomic sequencing, bioinformatics, and molecular medicine business segments. Today, I have the honor of serving as a moderator to a very distinguished group of individuals who are at the legal forefront of the digital health revolution. With that, I'll turn this over to our first panelist to introduce himself. René?
Yeah, thanks, Roger, and thanks for inviting me to this great panel. So I'm René Quashie. I am the Vice President for Digital Health at the Consumer Technology Association. We are a large trade association based in the United States, made up of about 1,500 member companies, and I run their digital health portfolio.
Thank you. David?
Hi, I'm David Wallace. I'm Senior Patent Counsel at Johnson Johnson. I've been here for about almost 5 years or so. I'm part of a group that's focused on digital health, and there's a group in the Bay Area right out here in San Francisco that's doing quite a bit on med tech, precision medicine, and various other digital health matters.
Thank you, David. And Irina?
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Irina Ridley. I'm General Counsel at Neuropace, a company that's focused on transforming the lives of people living with epilepsy. I've been in healthcare my entire career and have really focused on companies that are at the forefront of the data, digital health innovation. And so really interested in how data is treated and how data is a part of delivering our healthcare to patients.
Great. Thank you, Irina. Well, first off, thank you all again for participating in today's panel, taking a deeper look at some of the most pressing healthcare data issues. Digital health is one of the most exciting segments of the healthcare industry. It is a confluence of traditional healthcare paradigms with digital tools and solutions that have the potential to transform and improve healthcare delivery to the masses by removing healthcare access barriers, lowering healthcare costs, and taking a data-driven approach to personalizing patient healthcare. One area of digital health innovation that's received a lot of attention in recent years is artificial intelligence and machine learning. Healthcare models can be powered by big data analytics and or AI machine learning techniques to ensure that a patient's uniqueness factors into the prevention and treatment of disease conditions that the patient is suffering from. Moreover, the same healthcare data can also be used to train AI machine learning algorithms for intelligent drug design, clinical course selection applications, et cetera, that aid in the discovery and clinical study of novel therapeutics and repurposing of existing therapeutics. I think most digital health researchers will agree that AI machine learning algorithms work best when they are powered by large quantities of high quality data. How the healthcare industry as a whole and companies individually addresses this need for data will really determine how successfully AI machine learning powered digital health solutions are implemented and ultimately adopted at the clinical level, and decide who the winners and losers are in the digital health marketplace. Now, turning to our panelists, my first question of the day is fundamental to today's discussion. There is so much data about individuals being collected using a variety of ways, such as mobile devices, mobile apps, social media, wearables, we can go on, that it's difficult to draw boundaries between what is considered healthcare data and what is just data about individuals. The implications are that healthcare data is afforded certain elevated standards of protection under HIPAA, CCPA, or under similar laws in the US and abroad. So what constitutes healthcare data and how do you define it?
I can get started. I have no idea what constitutes healthcare data. I think that is one of the issues that we need to wrestle with as an industry. If you had asked me this question 10 years ago, I think all of us would have had a much clearer picture of what constitutes healthcare data. But over the last, I would say, decade or so, we've learned that there are a lot of non-clinical factors that affect health, which theoretically can be considered healthcare data, right? What you shop for, even things such as your web browsing habits can be considered healthcare data. So I think the answer to your question, from my perspective, is we don't really know, given all the impacts other non-clinical data have on healthcare data. But I think it's something that we need to continue to discuss because, as you say, things that are considered healthcare-related data are afforded certain protections that other data is not.
Thank you, René. Irina or David, anything to add here?
I agree with René. I think that, it's less about the question of what constitutes healthcare data, but really I think the only thing we can do is really focus on the disparate treatment, right? And I think it's, the question around data ownership comes up, the question around how the data is treated comes up. And so then, it's really just, and I agree, I don't think we know now, and I don't think we can know in the future, because the amount of data being generated from every interaction that a patient has with, their mobile device, their physicians, their clinicians, the devices that potentially are, they're using to treat a certain condition, even the medication that they're taking, right? It all is generating so much different types of data. We don't know what ultimately what will be used for that patient's treatment. We don't know what ultimately will be used to modify the care that they're receiving or the benefits that they're getting from this tool. But what we can do is figure out a way to maybe think about how we treat all of that data and how we're treating the data that it immediately is being used for treatment and for patient care. And so, I think the better question to ask is how we are, what we're doing with all this data, and this ultimately leads to the rest of the conversations or the rest of the questions and the rest of the discussion that we're going to have today. But what we're doing with the data, how we're protecting it for the patient, so that ultimately, regardless of what the data is, the patient feels comfortable that they are receiving, uniform care and uniform protections with all these different pieces of data that may be being generated or may be being used either now or in the future to deliver care.
Great, thank you, Irina. David?
Yeah, it's really about what's being used and what's its purpose. And so you could, if we look at the schemes that are in place to protect things, they're typically related to some privacy concerns. And can you draw out an individual patient's identification from some type of direct access to data? And there's things you can.
I think we had a little, sorry, we lost you for a moment there.
Oh, sorry about that. I think the question is making sure that we're looking at what the intent of the use of the data is, and rather than sort of trying to fit it into a bucket. And that should drive how we think about the other things we're going to talk about, which is, access, privacy, use rights, all those things.
Sorry, very good. Thank you, David. So now moving back on to the need for large quantities of high quality healthcare data to fuel, again, AI machine learning powered digital health solutions. What do you all see as the biggest hurdles for the healthcare industry players looking to gain access to large quantities of healthcare data? What's fundamental here?
Maybe I can get started again. I think there are three fundamental problems. One is data collection systems that aren't able to export data to other systems in a manner that the receiving system can process, right? So you have a whole bunch of data sitting over here. You want to export it over here, but the exportee is unable to process and receive that data. So that's number one. Number two is what I call the data combining problem. So if you've got a bunch of data collection systems that are using different documentation styles or data definitions, that creates a huge barrier to combining data. And let's face it, combining data, I think, is the key to a very rich future AI function in the healthcare space, given how siloed all the data is among all the various sectors within healthcare. So those are two of the major problems. And the other bucket I would add to this is what I would call the trust bucket. And I think in the trust bucket, you can put issues such as privacy, concerns about what's going to be done with data, how is data protected, is it anonymized, is it de-identified, all the issues that sort of go to trust. And to me, those are the three big buckets that I think about when I sort of think about barriers to data.
Well, and I'll add, I think those are excellent points. I'll add a couple more things. I think the overarching piece of it also is just, again, going back to the last question, is what the different data types are, what protections are in place for that data, right? How much of it is protected by HIPAA, CCPA, GDPR, how much of it is not, and then what consents have been in place and have been put in place, and the consents also tied to the trust bucket, right? How much discussion has been had with the patient or the individuals that data is being generated about, and what do they know in terms of what that data is ultimately going to be used for? How much of that have they agreed to that? Because even if consent is not necessary, because the data does not fall into one of those more regulated buckets, then it becomes really a reputational risk of moving that data and what that potentially could mean for the company in terms of that trust that the patient has put into the company and sharing that data with them.
Yeah, and then building on René's, the combination of the combining prong, what goes into that is oftentimes, there are a lot of different, there's a lot of variation in the quality of data, how things are defined. So if you're going to annotate a surgical video, and just getting somebody to standardize on what the proper labels are is quite difficult, right? That there's just no incentive right now to make sure that even if you were to get data in a structured format, what is that underlying data? Is it good data? And then I think how we think about qualitative or measures of data, because if you kind of move it forward down the process, you're going to process that data. So oftentimes we collect data without an endpoint in mind. And then we have these data sets that are not necessarily the best quality to serve those purposes of how we're going to use those endpoints. So I think, to build on what René said, that combining has a lot to do with what you're going to use it for. And so sometimes we have to get in front of how we combine those data sets should be purpose built for how we're going to use the data, or at least a set of different tasks we might use that data for downstream.
That's great. That's interesting. So digging deeper into this issue of difficulty in combining data, do you think industry-wide standardization of healthcare data could help? I mean, if so, how should industry players coordinate? What would that standardization framework look like?
So CTA is a nationally accredited standards body. So we believe in the power of standards to move sectors, right? Especially when you're talking about emerging areas of healthcare. I think standardization is incredibly important. So yes, I believe stakeholders in partnership with the federal government should seriously consider establishing national standards, including, by the way, harmonizing what already exists, which would govern minimum requirements for developing data sets and data formats. I think that would accelerate data consistency, that will enable better data exchange that David was talking about, data management, data aggregation, and it'll make it easier for organizations, researchers, companies to use data more effectively. Now, to be fair, at least in the United States, the federal government understands this, or is starting to understand this. So for example, the Office of National Coordinator for Health IT, which is an agency within the broader Department of Health and Human Services, has an advancing health data and metadata standards project, in which they are looking at creating and advancing what they call high priority health data and metadata standards using what they call the FAIR principles, FAIR meaning findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And part of their project is assessing the current landscape to figure out whether or not there are emerging gaps and what to do about them, encouraging industry folks to sort of participate in identifying the gaps, but also determining what kind of future data and metadata standards need to be created. So at least there's some movement on the federal government side. Now, having said that, I think these kinds of efforts are going to accelerate our efforts to harmonize high-end data, but there's so many different efforts that are underway that one of my issues is harmonization of all these standards. And by the way, you also have international standards like the ISO and the IEEE being the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, and others have developed their standards. So there's, for example, at ISO, which is the International Standards Organization, 8000, which governs a lot of sort of these data standards that we're talking about. But again, we've got disparate movements all around the world, and I think harmonization is going to be key. Now, for our part, CTA is working on its third standard related to AI in healthcare. And the thing we're looking at now very closely is how do you manage and characterize and describe all this data that goes into all these AI solutions. So we're very focused on creating standards from the tech side around data.
Very helpful, René. David, Irina, anything to add here?
That's a tough one. I mean, René's point, you have to harmonize what's out here right now. There are a lot of competing interests in making that happen. So how do you practically drive that? And I think there's a need to help the patients, those who are going to benefit from the use of the data, understand where we're at right now. and what standardization might mean for them. I mean, for those of us who are in the industry and who see it, we think standardization could reduce risks, could provide better solutions, because you are getting a better quality data set, and that the tools that operate on the data sets would then generate better solutions. But that's easy for us to
entry, right? It creates a barrier to entry for the types of data. There's so much of it coming from all different angles, but this allows some sort of a standard that we know we can trust to.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then if you think about it on the clinical side, with the FDA, we have to make sure that when we're releasing regulated, products and solutions, and AI-enabled solutions will get there. There are diagnostic solutions on the market that the FDA has approved, and other government entities outside the U.S. or regulatory bodies are involved in the same thing. The challenge there is, how do you make sure that we are making things more effective and easier for these regulatory bodies to say, are these things safe and effective? And when you're in a model, that's potentially black box, there's a lot of apprehension to say, well, we don't really know how this model is making this diagnosis. And if you step back, a lot of this is really more about the quality of the data set and then the algorithms. The algorithms have been around for a long time. I mean, folks were just talking about math. This hasn't changed. It's been around for a long time. We're applying those mathematical tools to data and then generating some type of classifier, some type of prediction, some type of outcome that's going to affect someone's life. Now, it would sort of be incumbent upon us to make sure that we're doing the best to partner with the regulatory agencies. That's why I think there is this public-private partnership that has to happen, and making sure that we're doing the best to educate them, and at the same time make sure we're educating the public that this is not some mysterious black box, AI bot that's going to take over the world, but this is really, demystify it, make it accessible. And I think if you get the public's understanding, you can drive adoption, because they're the ones, it's their data for the most part. And if the more they're involved in understanding what it's being used for and how it's being used, the more they can force all the stakeholders, the J&Js, the regulatory agencies, everybody to say, hey, this is what you guys need to do.
Those are some great points, and I'm going to go back to this data quality issue in just a moment. Actually, I think that warrants a lot greater discussion on there. Before I move there, so what do you think about data, healthcare data pooling? Is this a potential solution, or are there competing interests of companies just too great to overcome?
We've kind of done it in some transactions. There are reasons why you come together. Drug discovery is a big one, right? Because there's just there's solutions out there that are untapped, and we all have access to this wonderful resource called data. But more importantly, these companies have amassed a tremendous amount of know-how, and I call it domain expertise, to understand what the data means. And the challenge is, we've all got our own specialties, but we don't all have access to the raw data. So there have been transactions that we've been involved in where we work with third-party intermediaries that can, implement solutions and data sharing privacy with blockchain and various other things to allow us all to share in a repository of data, and then fork off our own individual sort of AI solutions to that data. But there had to be a reason to drive that, and it was just a collective sort of common ideology among a bunch of large pharma companies to say, hey, look, this is going to make sense, and we can do much better for a patient population if we pool our data together, and then we could equally benefit from it in our own unique ways without necessarily having to run the risk of exposing our innovation before we want to do so.
So I think I'll add a couple of things, and I apologize, I have construction happening outside my window, so that's why I'm trying to stay on mute. I think, one is, it goes back to the data quality piece, right? You want to make sure that whoever you're partnering with, and whatever that looks like, there is kind of a standard that both of you agree and understand that the data that you're actually going to be pulling and using and pulling from meets certain thresholds and certain standards that you yourself want for the data that you're going to be using ultimately. And then the other piece is just, and we'll get into this later, is what that arrangement looks like, right? What rights you're able to get from that data, what rights you have to that data, what you're able to do with it, how you're able to treat it. I think that determines whether or not pooling makes sense. So I think I don't know that there's a universal answer to that question, at least, not in the transactions that I've seen.
Yeah, and Roger, we, in sort of building our, I mentioned before that CTA is working on its third AI standard all about data. And this sort of concept of, we call it federated learning, I think is becoming more and more popular. And I think one of the reasons is because of just the vast quantities of data that exist. So I was watching a BBC program probably about 3 weeks ago. It was all about AI. And two things struck me about the program. One was that all the data that exists in the world today, 90% of it, I should say, has been created within the last 2 years. Then they interviewed a doctor at a hospital in Cambridge, and he said that the hospital had created more data that day than they created in the entire year of 1997. So given all these vast amounts of data that exist, and we can have a very interesting discussion about the quality of this data, but we all agree there's voluminous amounts of data. We're going to have to find ways to share, collaborate, and enter in these federated learning kinds of arrangements if we are going to realize the full potential of AI in healthcare.
It's very good, René. I mean, do you see like a construct that where, I guess, an industry group like the CTA would be kind of like the play a central role in these data pooling type of arrangements? Or do you see this as more of a separate organization that maybe individual companies would break down by sector? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think ironically it's going to take a group of us, right? So we represent the tech sector, but if you really want to do this properly, you're going to have to get other sectors involved. For example, health insurance companies have vast troves of data, right? So they're going to have to be brought in. Providers are going to have to be brought in. Academic medical centers are going to have to be brought in. So we can play our part, but I think it's going to take a collaboration across the entire healthcare ecosystem.
Sounds good. So moving back to this overarching issue about data quality as well, right? It's not just about the quantity, it's about the quality. What characterizes high quality healthcare data?
I can jump in. So for us, I think, first of all, high quality data has to be accurate and usable for its intended purpose. So just to give you an example of why this is important, over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of press around the issue of wearables and the use of green light technology, which doesn't work for people with darker skin. So people with darker skin who are using wearables relying on the green light technology, we're not getting the accurate data that the wearable was intended to generate. So just one example. So accuracy, usable for its intended purpose. The data has to be current and consistent. And I think most important of all, there's got to be a clear definition of the data element, and it has to be provided so that both current and future data users understand what the data means. Without that, sort of like a dictionary, I think you run into a lot of problems. And then I think the other important piece to point out here is the data quality has to be ensured the moment the data is accessed and through various points, right? Especially when you're integrating that data with other data. And I think that's incredibly important as well.
The one thing I'll add is, and René touched on it, is again the element of usability, and that comes from the side of the consent, right? Making sure that the data that you're amassing, the data that you have, and the data that you're ultimately going to be using, you have the right to use. That and again, René touched on this, is that it really the end user, the patient, they are aware of what data is being collected, what data is being generated, collected, and then ultimately what the use cases are, so that the consent element is taken care of early, and you figured out, and you have as broad a charter as possible to use that data for whatever purposes you want to use it, because one of the things you don't want to do is have to go back and either reconsent the patient, figure out, change course and figure out that you never had consent, and then have to deal with the issues that would bring.
Yeah, and along with the data definition, I think you need an appropriate data capture protocol that's consistent. We need to make sure that the data is generated in a way that can be consistent with that definition, but also understand if there are any variabilities in how the data was collected that would inform its use. At least you can go back and look at the protocol about how it was captured to say, okay, well, is this still usable for my purpose?
Thank you, David. And there's been, I think, in recent years, there's been a lot of discussion again around this data quality issue. And one topic actually comes up fairly frequently is that of healthcare data bias and the problem that it poses. And it's very interesting. I think, René, you brought up a scenario out there where I think it's the system itself, right, that biases the data, right, because it can't collect. The green light cannot collect data in a even way with folks with certain types of skin tones versus others. So maybe you can speak a little bit to this issue of this healthcare data bias, and why that's a problem. I know we covered some of the reasons, but interested in seeing your views on that.
Yeah, I think David touched on it very well in his last response. So, bias can be introduced into an AI system in so many ways, and that's part of the problem, right? David talked about how data is collected. Irina talked about how data is used. How is data selected from existing data sets? How are those data sets combined, right? So there are all kinds of points along the chain in which you can introduce bias. But there's all kinds of bias. And one of the things that we're wrestling with in the association is how to sort of capture and describe the bias. So for example, you've got algorithmic bias, right? Which is where you have an AI application or algorithm that precludes broadly inclusive results or produces the results that are inherently or systematically biased or prejudiced due to erroneous assumptions, right? You've also got model bias, which is an error in a machine learning algorithm, usually characterized by underfitting the training data, which is caused by low model complexity. So I think bias is an incredibly complicated issue. And then the other thing that a lot of our members have talked about is the difference between adverse bias, which is I think what we're talking about here, and intentional bias. And so we've had a lot of discussions about that. And what do I mean by intentional bias? So let's say, for example, you're building some kind of AI solution for sickle cell anemia. You're obviously going to want to preclude data from people who are never going to be affected by sickle cell anemia. And by way of quick background, sickle cell anemia affects people of African background primarily. And so there you have to build in what a lot of our member companies want to call intentional bias because of the ultimate goal in which you're designing the AI solution. So there's this sort of intentional bias versus adverse bias issue that's really part of our debate in our standards work as well. So again, just to reiterate, I think this is an incredibly complex issue. There are various ways which bias can be introduced into an AI system. And I think we could talk about solutions in a second, but I think we first have to understand the complexity of the problem before we start really talking about issues and solutions.
Irina and David, anything to chime in here?
We're going to get more when we get to the next questions. This is about to get fun.
But if nobody has anything, the other thing I will add is, by the way, there is an international standard out there that governs the life cycle requirements for the development of medical software. I think it's IEC 62304. And if you follow that process, I think developers will have a much clearer definition of their AI's, the AI solutions intended use, target user group, and all the other requirements. So I think following some certain preconceived and pre-thought protocols reduces the chance of bias along the AI development chain.
Okay, so you moved on to the next question I was going to ask again is how does the industry work towards eliminating this? Now, this is a federal standard that you're talking about.
No, it's a international standard developed by an international standards development organization.
Okay, I'm curious. Is that going to be, I guess, application specific, or that protocol or standard kind of applicable in all constructs?
It's applicable to medical software contained in medical devices.
Right. Any thoughts on this, David or Irina?
Irina, you want to jump in?
Sorry, I'm trying to close my window here so I can actually hear anything. I think that the bias piece again, it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg between the quality and the standards that René just mentioned and the implicit, at least, a bias that comes out of it. So the more we start working on building out the standards, making sure that there is kind of that barrier to entry that we talked about earlier on the quality of the data piece, I think inherently the bias is going to start going away. And rightfully so. I think right now there's a lot of inconsistency. There's a lot of kind of difference between different companies and how they generate data, between the information and the kind of the overview that the patient receives, between what happens from a data sharing perspective. And so I think that the more standardization that we start building into this, the more conversations we start having around that quality of the data. I think that's the only way that we can really work towards minimizing the biases around it.
Yeah, and there's also, as René said, this pops up in so many different places, and in every place it pops up, people are involved. So one of the ways you get at this is you get a broader set of diverse folks that are involved. You have more people with darker skin involved in the green light problem, then perhaps you don't have that issue, or it gets tamped down sooner. We've seen the same thing with facial recognition software. It's out there, and there's not enough variation or variability in the folks that are involved in these solutions, and that's not just tech companies. That's in healthcare companies as well. We need more pharmacologists. We need more people in precision medicine. We need more people in every point of the data generation, data use flow. And so that if you have that, then hopefully you can have enough human intervention to inform not just better policies, but policies that are more practical, that can actually be implemented, because there are situations where we do want some level of bias in there. We just don't want it to be necessarily adverse. We don't want it to build on healthcare disparities. So it's not that all bias is bad. Sometimes bias is helpful, but it needs to be informed by a broader population so that even folks that just necessarily don't know can become more aware, the more of us that are involved.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I'm sorry, go ahead, Irina.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's a really good point, but I think a lot of it also stems on kind of the trust element, right? I think there's the need for additional data. There's the need to ensure that we are kind of covering the basis across the entire pool of the data that we're trying to generate. But to do that, you also need to make sure that you're building trust, and that you're actually being able to tap into the larger pool that you want to be generating data from, and making sure that there is comfort in sharing that data back, and the knowledge that that data is not going to be misused or mishandled or mismanaged in some sort of way or form. So it's being able to tap, to reach your audience in a way that they're comfortable with, and you build that relationship that way.
Yeah, and just to add, I think David's point is such an important one because I think it exposes something in the tech community that we have to be careful about, or not just the tech community, but anytime you're dealing with technology, sometimes we seek technological answers to problems that are really human problems, right? And I think David touched on it beautifully there, which is a lot of times we are not looking at where some of these issues arise, and we're looking for solutions that may not actually work. So I think that's an important point to underscore, that technology is not separate and apart from the human experience, right? It augments the human experience. And sometimes I think we forget that.
Very good. So before I ask the next question, it's just kind of touched on earlier in one of your answers, right? I mean, I think René, you mentioned that there is an international protocol that is out there that folks can follow, that companies can follow to try to address some of these issues. Do you think the U.S. federal government has a role to play in rooting out this data bias issue? If so, what would be the best approach to take? And one construct I can think of is maybe really guiding how clinical trials are run with the FDA, right? I mean, there could be some more, I guess, defined guidelines on rooting on steps that either device makers or therapeutics companies can take to root that out. What are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a good point there. You raised the FDA. There are a lot of things we can do at the federal level to address some of these issues. But I think the number one thing we need to do, and I think David alluded to this in one of his previous answers, is education, right? We're talking about AI and machine learning. And I think what you find is when you start talking to people, whether it's on Capitol Hill or in the federal agencies, is that the understanding of the issues associated with AI and ML are not as sophisticated as you would think. And I think one of the things we as an industry have to do is we can't skip steps. You know, we always want to get to step 3 and 4, but I think we need to get back to step 1, make sure that we're educating folks on what these solutions are, what they aren't, what they can do, what the limitations are, and be very, very honest and upfront about what the potential issues could be with some of these solutions. So that's where I would start first, sort of education, and be much more intentional about how we communicate about what these technologies do. Beyond that, I think you're right. I think there are some agencies who are much more engaged in these issues. You mentioned FDA, but if you talk in the United States about for example, the Medicare and Medicaid programs, they're much less engaged in emerging tech. And so I think you have different agencies who have parts to play in the jurisdiction of these areas who are not up to speed.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's, it really is a conversation. I think, and the agencies are very open to that. I think they are, whether it's because, they're strapped for resources or they know that the industry is just, kind of is innovating faster than they're able to necessarily keep up with. They want to have those conversations. At least in my experience, I've been very, very successful in involving them early, involving them often, and or as often as they want to be involved, and being able to give them information, allow them to ask questions, and really work with them towards a solution. At least I've found that oftentimes that solution is very much in line with what we were trying to do, as long as they understand it, as long as they're able to kind of check their boxes by way of that conversation. I think it becomes a very good and healthy dialogue. But I do agree that and I think they're still trying to figure it out. I think they still have, there is a level of disconnect between the intra-agency around who has jurisdiction over what. And so it's making sure that you're kind of helping them figure that out as far as it, as it relates to you and what you're trying to do. But I have found that to be tremendously successful.
Yeah, and Irina, just to add to that point, I think this may usher in sort of a new era of public-private partnerships where
Yes.
Government and industry work together to solve some of these problems, because industry has an expertise and a knowledge that the government doesn't have. Obviously, the government has the authority that industry doesn't have. And this may usher in sort of a new era of public-private partnership out of necessity.
As it should, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything to add here, David, before we move on?
No, this is all good stuff. I would just hope that we don't try to figure it all out at once. Sometimes you get a working example and you move it through. I know it's a tendency we try to find the solution, and we frame it that way. And the federal government, of course, wants to find the solution. But sometimes the best way you can do this is incrementally through examples. And we just demonstrate through a lot of this is going to be public-private partnership as to lay the groundwork, provide a framework to say, this is what we've done. Here's what worked with this one. Here's what didn't work with this one. Here's some examples. And step outside the box. There's a lot going on across the pond, so to speak. And within Europe, they've been doing a lot of creative things with the same issues. And data is data and people are people. So I think it's just a matter of just trying to be focused on incrementally moving things forward.
So now moving on to the more applied side of today's discussion, let's explore y'all's insights on best practices to employ in data transactions, right? First it is, how do you approach negotiating agreements where data sharing is a core part of the transactions? What I mean by that is, what sections of the agreement do you pay most attention to and why?
So I'll start with that. I think, one of the core questions there is really, what are you ultimately trying to do with the data? I think it's having an understanding across the table with both, by both parties around what the ultimate goal of this data transaction is, right? What you want to do with it, how you want to do it. And then, it's really negotiating the rights to that. So, the parts of the agreement that you look at for that is obviously the IP section. What rights, are you getting an exclusive license? Are you getting a, what is it that you're, what do you need the rights to? Because you may not need to just, transfer the IP altogether. Maybe you need a non-exclusive license because what you're doing with it is novel and different and not really related to, what other companies could do with that data. So it really, I think, is one, a question of what you want to do with it, and two, what rights do you need to be able to do that? And I think part of it is also having an understanding internally what you want to do with that data, because I think that there are, sometimes within even an organization, there are conflicting viewpoints around what this data ultimately is, what the use case for this data is. And there's definitely sometimes a misunderstanding around what IP protections or requirements you need to be able to do whatever it is that you're trying to do. So I think it's just having internal alignment, and then it's making sure that whatever you're negotiating is, relevant to that and not necessarily above, beyond, or out of scope for what you're trying to do.
Anything to add, David?
Yeah, no, she hit on all the big ones. The fun one that often is overlooked is, what's the definition of data? And, anytime you start talking about, we talked about this, is it health data? Is it data about how a machine performed in a surgery that's operational? And so what is the corpus of data? And then what are the derivatives of the data or secondary uses? So if it's the raw data set, what about the annotations and all that stuff, how that informs the model? Then if I want to use the model to do something, is that vestige of the model still data? And so we oftentimes get into a lot of interesting discussions about, how far does data reach and what's actually in that. But I think it goes to Irina's point, which is it ultimately ends up with, what do you want to do with it? So if you have clinical purposes for it, then, we're going to, they're going to try to pull that in and make that really, really, really tight. If you're working with a research facility or an educational facility, sometimes there are other constraints where they can't give us certain access rights. But it just comes down to, what you want to use it for and what data is and what that means to you for that purpose.
Very good. Data valuation is becoming a more prominent consideration in healthcare transactions overall right now. So much so that I think in some ways it's surpassed the value of traditional intellectual property rights, such as patents and trademarks. So how does an entity or a company go about valuing its data in a transaction?
Yeah, how bad do you want it? I think that's what it comes down. No, in all seriousness, I think oftentimes we get tripped up on the value of the raw material and trying to project what we can extract from that, or what one of our peers might be extracting that pure company, or when you're working with the tech companies, it's completely different, right? So your ability to take that raw material, process it, and exploit it based upon what you can add to that should drive the value. That's a tough one to sell sometimes internally, because it goes back to the whole education process. Do people really understand, how the data is going to be used to solve the technical problem? And when you get, misinformation or different understandings of what that is, it really drives the value. And I've seen a lot of times where, someone has a rich data set and we're thinking, well, that's worth X amount in exchange for, you give us the access to the data set, so we can generate some models and do the following. Then of course someone wants a right to the model, and then you get into, well, what's the data worth? And then the business development team says, is this worth acquiring them? All sorts of things happen, but I think people sort of miss on the fundamental issues, which is, well, what are you adding to it that's going to drive value, whether that's commercial value or clinical value or whatever that is. And I think that's where you have to step back and look at, what your domain expertise is. If you're a cloud service provider like an AWS or a Google or a Microsoft Azure, they provide a lot of, different value adds to being able to process and exploit data from an infrastructure standpoint. And now they all have healthcare teams too. So they're building on this notion of trying to really exploit and refine that raw material to drive more value toward the patient. And I think it's that value toward what the patient solution is that's the ultimate value for a lot of us. And we're trying to get away from just looking at, the data set by itself.
I think that's spot on, David. I think going back to some of our earlier points, we often get tripped up in trying to own the data, own the raw data, own, the underlying models, all the different pieces. But again, ultimately, it's what do you want to do with that data? And you may not need to go through the exercise of trying to own all the underlying pieces of that data if all you're really looking for is a model that you're then going to extrapolate from and do something with. So I think it's understanding what the ultimate use case of that data is, what it is that you're trying to actually do, and then really educating your stakeholders on, and your teams that this may, that what you need is actually commensurate with what you're trying to value, and ascribing the value to the data that you're actually going to then benefit from, not trying to, take on more than you need, and not trying to kind of go two steps ahead when something else will do.
Now, I think we've answered before I go to the next question. I think you, Irina, and David have answered this sort of in a orthogonal way already, but I'm going to ask it anyways. What are the ways in which data owners can structure data sharing agreements with data users, such as data analytics or insights companies, such that they can benefit from the aggregation with other third-party data sets? I think you guys touched on some of those points already, but I'll kind of leave it open to you to see if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, from my standpoint, I really think it's just, I'm going to repeat myself again, but it's understanding what it is that, understanding the value of my own data, and understanding what I'm comfortable sharing, what I'm not comfortable sharing, who the audience is, right? Who is it that I'm trying to sell my data to? Is it going to be used for a commercial purpose? Is it going to be used for a clinical purpose? Is it going to be used, just for something else? What is it that my data is ultimately going to be used for? And structuring an agreement that protects my data outside of the scope of what, that does not surpass the use case that we've been discussing and negotiating.
Yeah, then there's the practical hedge that always comes up, because the data providers say, well, what about these things that I haven't contemplated? So let me draft this agreement that's a bit overreaching because I'm not sure what I don't know yet. So let me make sure I hang on to rights to your model. I will limit your right to commingle the data. I want the data to stay like I have it. And importantly, I want the data to remain in my computational environment, and you can have access to it there. And if you run any machine learning tools on it, they're going to have to be executed in my environment as well. I mean, it becomes impractical sometimes, but as the data the data provider, they have to jump in front of that. And of course, there are consent issues too. They have to make sure that they can actually provide the data for the purpose that folks like J&J and these other companies are saying, hey, look, we need to use that data for XYZ today, but maybe 6 months from now, we need to use it for something else. So you got to make sure all those things are buttoned up.
Makes a lot of sense. So now I was going to go a little bit into some of the geopolitical considerations discussion, but I think we're kind of running out of time. So I think I propose that we should just kind of go to the question and answer session, and we'll skip that the section on geopolitical considerations for another time.
Yeah, thanks, Roger, and thanks to the rest of the panel as well for your comments, and brilliantly timed as well. Bang on the hour, essentially. So thank you for that. If anybody does have any comments, do feel free, and questions, feel free to post them away. And while we wait for any of those to stream in, I'll just, and I suppose it's not right for me to summarize what you guys have spoken about for the past 55 minutes in a couple of sentences, but I suppose there's so much promise on improving healthcare data from the viewpoint of standardization and quality and sharing. And it's great to hear and see that the industry is taking this seriously, and ultimately for the aim of wanting to improve the patient's educations and needs and outcomes, which is, as I say, hugely important, especially when you have all of those competing factors. And I suppose one of those competing factors, Roger, which you did just mention, is certainly geopolitics. And I would just, from my point of view, I suppose, like to ask and get your respective views on, I suppose, just how geopolitical concerns, I suppose, regarding healthcare data have weighed in at the moment on the industry and on data. And I suppose whether you think healthcare data will ever override and come to the fore as opposed to the bad relationships and any sanctions that we may be seeing globally. So I suppose just very quickly, if anybody would like to add a couple of sentences to that, I'd be glad to hear.
I can take a stab at this. I mean, data has been called the new oil, and healthcare data accumulation, privacy use, and monetization viewed by many countries as a matter of national security. Right? We've seen in the last couple of years deals here in the United States that have been stopped in its tracks because there's fears that I guess the data would fall in the wrong hands and be used in a way that's probably not consistent with the interests of the citizens of this country, the U.S. and whatnot. So I think it is going to be in the forefront. I think is actually going to stop some deals, frankly, right? And it's also going to create a lot of barriers and cooperation between companies that are in certain countries relative to our own. That's almost inevitable in a lot of different ways. I mean, how much that's going to harm innovation and I guess and progress, it's hard to say, frankly. But it is going to be a part of it. I don't see it going away, frankly. And I think a lot of companies will will think twice about doing deals and collaborating with certain other entities just based on that alone.
Thanks, Roger. And if David or René or Irina would like to give their own personal opinion, be glad to hear of it.
Yeah, I think the other area where you're going to see this is in policy, right? I think from the United States federal government perspective, whether you're talking about the Trump administration or the Biden administration, I think on this they have the same view, ironically, which is that the United States is in an economic and technological international super competition in the emerging technology space. And I'm talking about AI, machine learning, quantum computing, 5G, IoT, and that there's a sense that the U.S. may be falling behind. And that's why the Trump administration announced 2 years ago is committing $300 billion for research and development in these emerging tech areas. The Biden administration is making similar commitment. And you see it reflected in policy. The one I'll bring up is the White House issued an executive order and then followed it up, this is the Trump administration, with guidance for AI regulation, in which the central tenet of the guidance document was we need to reduce barriers to the use of AI technologies to promote innovation in the United States. And so I think and the Biden administration, by the way, aligns with that perspective. And so what I think you're going to see, at least in the United States, is more flexible, risk-based approaches that really promote AI innovation, viewed from the broader context that we're in this international super competition in which we may be losing some ground to other countries.
I think the one thing I'll add from the industry standpoint is that as you're looking as companies look to do business OUS, those geopolitical considerations become extremely important from a reputation and a trust perspective. And the moment that you announce that you're going into a particular country, well, that comes with a significant amount of considerations in terms of how your customers feel about that, whether the customers are payers, providers, patients, and then what you're doing to make sure that they get comfortable around that. So I think it's inherently from an industry standpoint, it is a significant, I don't want to say concern, but consideration, and making sure that you are well equipped to handle, the potential consequences, questions, and issues that come up with this transaction, even if you've thought through all the, the technical and the legal and the operational elements of that data transfer.
Yeah, and the other layer to that, there are so many different types of healthcare systems throughout the world. And I think, I'm not sure if it was René or Irina brought this up earlier, they hold a tremendous amount of healthcare data at their disposal. Tapping that data is key. And so finding a way, and it goes back to everything else we're saying, how data is captured, how data is stored, the use of that data, the protocol for using that data. That's something where public-private partnership can help. And I think as these standards start evolving, and I'm sure René's plugged into what's going on outside the U.S. as well, we're starting to collaborate where we can. And I think a lot of that, dealing with the practical issues of how you actually can get data from a raw material to a clinical decision is happening. And hopefully there's enough momentum, pressure, or good that comes out of this that some of these geopolitical issues can be just minimized, because it just makes sense. And, we're all just people, and people just want better healthcare, and they want access to that data. So I'm super hopeful that, maybe the politicians get out of the way, because people are going to get in the way and start driving responsibility for their own healthcare by making sure they understand how to utilize the data.
That's a brilliant way to end, David, with positivity, and I think that word collaboration is key for sure as we go into the future. So again, thank you to you all for coming along, sharing your views and so forth. And unfortunately, the webinar can only last 60 minutes or 63 as we are now. But if we got together again, I say in 12 months' time, I'm sure we'll have seen a lot of progress on the front that we've spoken about today, but also a lot of new challenges that will come to the forefront. So, for now, I hope that everybody who's tuned in today has found the discussion extremely interesting and have plenty of takeaway thoughts and knowledge to add. And again, finally, thank you to David, Roger, Irina, and René for providing the discussion. And again, final thing from me, please do feel free, if you have the time, to go to the speed networking sessions after this. It's down the left-hand side of your screen. Do feel free to click on that, speak to some of the fellow panelists and anybody else who's tuned in. So again, thank you to you all. I wish you a great summer, and do keep safe, and we'll hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.